Hello, everyone. Welcome to the new museum. You're welcome. My name is Alethea Rockwell, and I'm the Keith Haring Director of Education and Public Engagement here. I'm thrilled to welcome you to tonight's program, Herstory, Responses to the City of Ladies. I'll start with a land acknowledgement to recognize that the new museum is on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples, the original inhabitants of Manhattan. As we gather here tonight, we begin by paying our respects to the Lenape, past, present, and future. So this program is organized in conjunction with our current exhibition, Judy Chicago Herstory, curated by Massimiliano Gioni, Gary Carrion Moriari, Margot Norton, and Madeline Weisburg. And tonight, we're gonna look specifically at the City of Ladies, which is an exhibition within an exhibition. It's on view on the 4th floor of the museum, and it brings together the work of over 80 women and genderqueer artists from across centuries to contextualize Judy Chicago's practice within a genealogy of feminist art making. So we have 3 incredible writers who we've invited to be with us tonight: Kate Zambreno, Simone White, and Sophie Lewis. And they've been invited to select works from the installation and then respond to them through their own perspectives, actively using the display to make new connections across time. So Kate Zambreno is the author of many books, most recently The Light Room, a meditation on art and care, and Tone, a collaborative study with Sophia Samatar. Simone White is a poet and critic and is the author most recently of the book-length poem Or on Being the Other Woman, and the forthcoming critical companion book, Warring. And Sophie Lewis is a writer and a teacher who is the author of Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, and Abolish the Family, a Manifesto for Care and Liberation. So tonight, we're gonna start with a brief introduction to the City of Ladies from Madeline Weisburg, assistant curator here and one of the exhibition co-curators. She'll set the scene and show you some of the works and themes in the installation. Then we'll have presentations from each speaker. Kate will be responding to works by Dora Maar and Claude Cahun, with some other connections, I think, too. Simone will respond to the carpet that was designed by Judy for the installation, which is really exciting. And she's also gonna make some connections with a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe. And Sophie will speak in response to archival material about the suffragette Mary Richardson. Then Madeline will return to moderate a conversation with them, and finally we'll open up to questions from all of you, so think about your questions. And then the exhibition is open tonight until 9 p.m., so you could go see the installation in person. You're very welcome to visit after the program. And before we get started, I just want to thank the New Museum education staff who make these programs happen: Austin D. Bose, Ginny Haw, and Derek Wright. I want to thank our speakers, Kate, Simone, and Sophie. Thank you for being here. We're really grateful to you for being here and sharing your brilliant work with us. And thank you to Judy Chicago. She's not here, but I'm going to thank her anyway because her show has just opened up so many opportunities for us, including tonight. So with that, I'm really to pass things over to Madeline.
Hi, everybody. My name is Madeline Weisburg again, and I'm an assistant curator here at the New Museum. And thank you to Alethea and the whole team in the education department for putting together these amazing programs that have been happening over the last few months. So I'm just going to give a brief intro to what is happening on the 4th floor of the museum. I know maybe some of you have seen it already, and for those of you who haven't, we invite you to come after the program is over. The museum closes at 9. But as part of Judy Chicago's 6-decade survey here, we've transformed the 4th floor galleries into a very special group installation that we've entitled The City of Ladies, which we're here to discuss today. The installation features Judy's work alongside, as Alethea said, the work of nearly 90 other artists and historical figures who are both women and genderqueer artists and historical figures and writers who she's placed within her own alternative canon. And I'll just show you These include some works that are very, very unusual for a contemporary art museum, including the work of Artemisia Gentileschi, Charlotte Solomon, Virginia Woolf, among others. So we have some artists that are assigned to different groupings relating here to ideas about self-portraiture or the representation of the self. We have other artists who are thinking along lines around surrealism. We're working in the interwar avant-garde or a little bit after the war, including Frida Kahlo, Merritt Oppenheim, the amazing work of Remedios Varo, who also, her best friend, Leonora Carrington, is also in the work. We have other objects that are relating to ideas around cosmic abstraction, including very, very special pieces such as a medieval manuscript by Hildegard von Bingen all the way from the late 1100s, as well as a Hilma af Klint painting. Other works that are relating to ideas around birth and motherhood, including works by Elizabeth Catlett, Zora Neale Hurston, Paula Modersohn-Becker, as well as many artists who are very much playing with the representation of gender and thinking about how the self is represented, including works by Romaine Brooks or Jean Mamen, Florence Henry. So I should say that comprising a show within a show, this personal museum, which we worked on in very close collaboration with Judy, really contextualizes her work within the very disruptive, subjective spirit of artist-curated exhibitions, as well as the transhistorical nature of her own research work. She started doing research on women's history and women's art history in the late 1960s when she became involved in the women's movement. And so here, presented beneath the golden banners, I'll go back to this, of her project that's called The Female Divine, as well as this special carpet that she designed. We have this group installation that's really like a group portrait. The title is named after a work by the medieval writer and historiographer named Christine de Pizan, who wrote a book in 1405 called The Book of the City of Ladies, which was this group biography about renowned women through history, including artists, writers, warriors, inventors, saints, and scholars. And the book was really meant to be like a city in the sense that all of the figures that were in it really brought together the ideas of the foundation or the walls or the towers of the building. And likewise, all the artworks here really contribute to the overall structure. And so just really quickly, I'm sure anyone, oops, uh-oh, I ended it. I'm so sorry. Okay. Are we back? Okay. Apologies. Okay, so many of you, of course, know of Judy's most famous project, which is the dinner party that she made between 1974 and 1979, which is permanently installed at the Brooklyn Museum and debuted at SF MoMA in 1979. So for this project, with a group of dedicated researchers, they compiled a group of names of almost 3,000 women throughout history to be included on this display, including 39 women who were given a seat at the dinner party, as well as 999 other names written beneath. There have been many projects in response to the emissions of this, including a great project that we have on the 7th floor of the museum called the International Honor Quilt, where other people were invited to make their own pieces of a quilt for figures that they felt should have been included. But, as early as the early 1970s, Judy was doing research with her students at the feminist art program, both at Cal State and Fresno, and then at Cal Arts, where they put together some of the earliest slide libraries on women's art history. And then, on the 2nd floor of the museum, you can see some of her projects, including amazing abstract works from the mid-70s, where she dedicates the painting to specific women throughout history. And so I am so happy to have 3 amazing speakers here today who are going to respond to specific pieces that are included on the 4th floor in the exhibition design. So thank you so much, and I will welcome Kate to the floor.
Hi everyone. Is this going to turn on? I feel like my future as a public intellectual isn't going to work out because the idea of running a slideshow like this fills me with so much dread. My students here can attest to that if you've ever seen me try to do a slideshow. Okay, just go next slide. It's fine. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alethea and Madeline and everyone at New Museum. I often ask myself when standing inside a museum, usually the auditorium reserved for such events, why am I here? What have I been asked to say? I'm often asked to speak on behalf of an artist or artists, whether living or dead, usually not at their request, but at the request of others. For this, I receive compensation. For events like these, I ask for $1,000. It is a gig. I heard some gas, so I'm like, oh no, but it's just part of my praxis lately. I have to think, sometimes for weeks, about the artist or artists and sometimes write something new. I have to shower and put on an outfit, usually one of a rotation of dresses I use for such occasions, even though otherwise I would never wear a dress. Someone else has to watch the children. In this case, it's their father who's supposed to take on my usual division of labor for the night, although it's usually not done when I get home. Dinner, dishes, bath time, reading before bed, which he usually does, cleaning up laundry, getting the lunches prepared, helping put out their clothes for the next day, worrying over the structure and schedule of the next day, physically wrangling the children, usually my terrain. I usually pay for a car to the city there and back, even though, again, this is something I never do otherwise, so I can be home as soon as possible and relieve the one who is watching them. I have to be on stage and say something witty or knowledgeable, or hopefully witty and knowledgeable. I talk and actively listen to people on the stage, my fellow gig workers, and then I talk and actively listen to people afterwards, and then I go home and wake up to get the children off to school, and usually then have work of my own, usually teaching and student meetings if it's during the week. The New Museum originally offered me $500, but I said I couldn't do it unless it was $1,000, because it's my rare week off from teaching and my children also being in school for me to actually try to be what I think my primary vocation is, that of a thinker and writer of books. They said it was outside of their budget. Eventually, they got back to me and said yes. I've been told the check is waiting for me to hand to me when this event has concluded. I double-checked. I actually have been struck with the cough that's going around. It's not COVID. I think it's a lingering sinus infection, along with exhaustion and general ill health, and have been going back and forth over whether to cancel, but have not because of this check and what it could pay for. Usually a check like this tends to disappear into the vast sinkhole of our lives. Lately, I've been struck by the disconnect between the capital that the museum usually represents, or the profits or corporate sponsorship of the artists that I'm asked to speak for, and what I get paid to perform as a writer in this way, whether for a catalog or a panel as I'm here tonight. When I said this to Simone White, when I met with Simone and Sophie Lewis over Zoom, neither of whom I knew personally before, to discuss this panel, she suggested that I read Herstory. I say this so I'm not standing in front of Simone White citing Herstory, because it's also important to me that Simone White told me to read Herstory to help contextualize the labor I perform within these art institutions. Also, it's crucial to say that somewhere in the network of thinking about standing up here, performing this labor, leaving the space of my home where I'm performing other labor, I'm also thinking with Sophie Lewis and their body of work and thought. This is important, I think, the idea of thinking with as opposed to thinking alone. Herstory, should I start the slideshow? Okay. Herstory is writing about the economy of the contemporary art world as being about presence, physical presence. An institution sells tickets for an event such as this one, and it's a way of selling access to a panel or group of select people, usually artists, scholars, and writers. It is profitable and cheaper to capitalize on presence if you get paid this way, Herstory writes, and I'd add the pay is so much less than what the visual art is worth, and more pay to see it. This labor is privileged but extremely replaceable, like I find in my other parasitic relationship with the institutions of creative writing. If I had said no, they would have found someone else to stand in for me, or really stand in for the artist somehow. I think I'm asked to be here because I'm a writer who already lives in New York, so they don't have to pay for transport, and also because I'm a woman, or seen as a woman, and my work is read as feminist, and because of that, quite often misunderstood or mislabeled. Also, I think increasingly because I'm a mother, so I'm hoped to speak somehow to motherhood. This perception of my gender identity, because I've written books seen as being woman books or feminist books, can often feel flattening. The idea of gender is flattened, or the idea of myself within the context of gender or my feminism, as opposed to, like these artists I'm speaking of here, thinking of the self and hence gender as playful, unstable, open to transformation. When I considered the wall of the artist provisionally considered part of surrealism and modernism in this show, the subject of a book I wrote named Heroines is after a Claude Cahun text. I thought of their refusal to be flattened, their opacities, and their insistence that they were not part of this avant-garde tradition that was almost entirely masculine, even though, even now, they're often read as and marginalized as part of two groups, either surrealist or women, but their work refused both and neither. They were invested through their commitment to multiplicity and mystery, to the mutability of realism, resisting realisms, either aesthetically or politically, and how these connect. The resistance of realisms aesthetically leading the resistance of one's current realisms. Elvia Wilk once wrote recently, thinking of literature now and its relationship to protesting the current genocide and undoing the binary of colonialism and oppression. Realism is about perception. We cannot let our perceptions of reality become totalizing, permanent, or fixed. Only by insisting on the mutability of realism can we change reality itself. This was, I believe, part of the project of Maya Deren, who wrote, "I am concerned with that point of contact between the unreal and real, where the unreal manifests in reality, as well as the photo works and collages of Claude Cahun and Dora Maar." Often Claude Cahun's photographs of masquerade across the gender spectrum are labeled as self-portraits. This is in many ways a misreading. For one, some of these investigations into the self and other as I see them were not only a form of drag and disguise, both hyper-femme and male dandy variations, but actually documentations of theatrical characters she performed as part of an avant-garde theater group, drawing on traditions satirizing dramatic realism ranging from Alfred Jarry's theater of the absurd to Dada cabaret to Japanese no to the ancient Greeks, an exaggeration of naturalistic acting gestures, the human actor as puppet, and the mask. Written texts also informed Cahun's private theater, such as Heroines, the series of monologues of mythical figures ranging from Salome, Sappho, and Cinderella, Eve, parodying the traditional feminine roles like a staging of a guignol. The photographs and collages were private yet collaborative. Claude Cahun and her lover, partner, stepsister, Marcel Moore, both with androgynous names they took as their own, staged these performances in their home, first in their studio in Montparnasse and then on the Isle of Jersey, where they also collaborated on a resistance against the Nazis stationed there. Marcel Moore would translate BBC broadcasts from an illegal radio into German, and then Cahun would write them as rhymed couplets or conversations, signing them "the soldier with no name," and they would print them on these pamphlets or traces, often with Moore's illustrations, and distribute them, often wearing rumpled clothes and wigs as costumes. Once imprisoned for these acts, Cahun wrote of the necessity of wartime resistance as artists. Quote, "We are essentially against nationalisms, separatisms, that is, against war." The we is important here. The insistence on being together, thinking together. Both Marcel Moore and Claude Cahun signed anti-war manifestos and were part of Contra-Attack Call to Struggle, calling for a revolutionary offensive against fascism rather than intellectual debate, as was Dora Maar, whose anti-fascism inspired Picasso's activism, as well as his famous painting at Guernica, which Maar documented via film. I like thinking of the juxtaposition of these two photographs here. The puppet of Cahun's is part of a series of photographed ready-made objects and puppets where the self or figure is not hiding but missing. It read "La Père," the father, and with the absurdity of the stick as penis, or it's like a firecracker, and other trappings, and in the context of the later military puppets she made, this seems to represent the father or the soldier or patriarchy. It is a great companion to the Dora Maar, who is most famous for her face, the weeping woman, Picasso painted over and over, but made these sly photographs, such as Ubu Roy here, the photograph of the tiny beast, the fetal armadillo in the jar, named after the grotesque tyrant in the Alfred Jarry play, also connecting to Maar's background in agitprop and political theater. Both these works were made by women, although so much of Claude Cahun's life and work was resisting this binary, but they are taking on masculine caricatures, puppets really, to protest a fascist ruler or worldview. Gender is flattened here, but in a parodic, knowing, exaggerated way, allowing for the carnivalesque, for the norms to be overturned. I think about whether Claude Cahun would want to participate in an event called Herstory Response to the City of Ladies. I think she would want to know the tone of the event title or the exhibit title. Was there an element of passionate resentment to it, like Christine de Pizan's original allegory, The Book of the City of Ladies, the medieval writer's antidote to Boccaccio and other male representations of women, or of self-parody with fictions or ghosts, like Cahun's own heroines, or of one's own queer community, like her contemporary Jejuna Barnes's book of Repulsive Women, also represented here. I have questions looking at this diptych, where it's situated on the floor of the museum, within the questions on the banners, questions that I'm not sure can be resolved. How to speak about anti-capitalist and anti-fascism and its role in art in this context, in this institution here, when I'm asked to speak nominally about artists in regards to their gender. I try to have reparative readings of this show within the show, the rhizomatic network through creating an alternative canon of everyone seen as a woman in their lifetime, even though their private lives and art might have resisted that as well. I wonder, though, at an alternative canon that leaves out one's contemporaries, or even artists who are making art as well in the 60s and the 70s. There is a sense she's the last woman artist on earth. What is it about feminism, reduced to the idea of a woman, which feels so reductive? What is feminism without being about citation and the relational? My friend Sophia Samatar and I, who often correspond and work in collaboration, have been having an ongoing debate on genius, like whether it exists. Who of our contemporaries are geniuses? Who are not geniuses? We, who are never called genius and don't need to be called genius. Genius, I write to her, seems like a land where you are alone, and it erases the labor of everyone in conversation with you. It feeds into the scarcity model of capitalism, or even the idea of one artist in a retrospective, or not seeing the artist as working in collective, in collaboration with others' labors. The art genius disavows the communal and collaboration. It disavows reciprocity. I'm almost done. We've been reading together, as we often do, Edward Glissant's Poetics of Relation. She sends me this quote: I'm doing the same thing in the way I say we, organizing this work around it. Is it some community we, rhizomed into fragile connection to a place, or a total we involved in the activity of the planet, or an ideal we drawn in the swirls of a poetics? I like thinking of these artists, for they probably knew each other, at least tangentially in a scene, as communicating with each other. Perhaps they weren't trying to be geniuses. Their art was about the ephemeral, the absurd, the mortal, the act of protest, and the documentation of the private, both the collaborative and communal. An exhibit such as this does allow us to make these connections. It asks us to put these artists in their time, in relation and network with each other, communities and connections, not in isolation, which is so often how art is considered in questions of capitalism success. I is so above the rest. It is so alone. It asks us questions like, can I say we? How can we say we? When is it actually we? Thank you.
I don't know how to do this either, so. Okay. That was marvelous. Thank you, Kate. We did talk a little bit before we arrived here today, so it turns out there are going to be some areas of overlap in our conversational addresses. I can't see. Can you see me? Okay. I usually skip the institutional thanks, but thank you, Alethea. Thank you, Madeline. I'm actually kind of enjoying myself because I can see this is going to go strangely. So, I'm gonna read a little bit, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit freely about some of the slides, which we'll see in a moment. Black feminist critics are often invited to speak to the exclusion or misrepresentation of Black women within a given discourse. The greatest examples of Black feminist theory, however, shift the terms of critique away from non-dialogue and exclusion to the actual dynamics of Black women's experience. One great example is Lorraine O'Grady's 1992 essay on the invisibility of the Black female body in visual art, Olympia's Maid, Reclaiming Black Female Subjectivity, which of course comments on the treatment of Sojourner Truth in Chicago's The Dinner Table, which you may know, in which Sojourner Truth, instead of having appeared as a vagina, appears in another form of iconography. There, O'Grady famously declares that chaos is the symbolic name of Black women. I also love Hortense Spiller's Interstices, a small drama of words, but that's for another time. Some people might hear echoes of Cedric Robinson and Black Marxism here. The phrase total rejection of our lot haunts and needles me as a description of the ethical position of Black radicalism. In my recent critical work, I questioned the transhistorical power of total rejection as the irreducible material of Black existence and thought. Consequently, I find myself squirming around under my own impulse to oppose, correct, object, and redirect. But this is what remains as a matter of faith or belief. I can acquit myself as a Black woman artist, a 21st century Black feminist, only by not doing, as a matter of poetics, what I am required and expected to do. That is, provide supplementary, explanatory statements that presume and reproduce a kind of representation that I do not deal or believe in. I cannot tell you what the thing means. To speak over and thus cathect the object, which is a mystery, which confounds and repels interpretation. I cannot do this thing that I am frequently asked to do. In City of Ladies, the thing I was most drawn to was underfoot, perhaps intended to recede into the background, which is exactly why I was drawn to it, and why my remarks are directed toward it today. You see this carpet here, which you can't see all that well, but I'm going to describe in a moment, is this, maybe you've been upstairs, it's kind of a rich, like, not quite aubergine, it's got like more of a pink
color, and it is covered in images of violets and irises and roses. I've just begun a new project that I'm calling For the Roses, after the 1972 Joni Mitchell album. Also, no one asked me to talk about Joni Mitchell or anybody who was alive, but here we are. Joni Mitchell's work has been privately foundational to my poetics and my sense of what's possible as a woman artist. I had never written about her until I was asked to contribute to a special issue of Hauser and Wirth's in-house magazine, Ursula, for a special poetry issue, co-edited by the painter Nicole Eisenman. The prompt was simply, write a poem about a work of art. I have a violent reaction to the idea of commissions, essentially institutional offers to buy or rent new poems, for reasons I've already alluded to. This kind of offer is economically and artistically impossible. I make my living as a professional intellectual, but there's a difference between what I do as an artist and what I do when I'm called to appear or perform. The only way I've figured out how to negotiate this felt difference with respect to particularly art world demands to perform poet is to reject ekphrastic approaches altogether. That is, the interesting question, the only reason to participate, can be, what approaches can I take to an existing work to which an institution points that attends to the formal problems I'm actually considering as a matter of poetry? How can writing within the commercial demand for writing not function as a distorted or impoverished simulation of my own thought, or not my own thought at all? This was the question for me and for you today. This elaborate floral carpet, a replica of a catwalk carpet originally commissioned from Judy Chicago by Dior, resonated with the problems I've just described. Like, what is an appropriate poetic relation to have to this corporation, ideology, thing that I actually did not ask to be involved with? Once this set of tensions is understood as a subject for art in itself, it becomes a formal problem and thus a real one. I'm not going to say that much more about the carpet, but one thing I do want to note is that when I asked for some information about what the carpet was, I got a blast of romantic, medieval romance, and I was blown away, what? And I'll say more about that in a second. Going back to the Ursula Hauser situation, I ended up writing a poem called The Clothespin. Joan Retallack's great long poem, Memoir, inspired this poem. I had been struggling with the idea of memory and memoir. Was it possible to satisfy what seemed like competing impulses? I was obsessively planning a sculpture performance about my mother's relationship with flowers and my relationship with her and flowers. I kept thinking about returning to Philadelphia as a site of juridical and economic violence, the violence that made me, and to continue to theorize Black women's sexual freedom, asking whether it was true that, as Hortense Spillers has claimed, sexuality isn't what Black women have as gendered desire. Joni pushed forward in the poem as a figure for the embryonic awareness of feminine artistic possibility and also of segregation. I'm just going to read a couple lines from the poem so you'll have an idea why Joni and segregation go together. In childhood, this is from my poem, in childhood, segregation was not allowed the girl, who is essentially unhanded by Jim Crow, the last little plinkety SOS barely on a t-shirt, which results in incidental denial of Joni Mitchell, who implies segregation and also somehow allows, through the girl, distortion of the interpretive tools that would tell us what she would be allowed to become in the built city, and her movements through and away from it, the accidental discovery of the fact that art would not necessarily kill her. What is a flower? What do flowers do? What capacity do flowers have to produce sexual meaning, to produce that elusive or non-existent thing, Black women's sexuality? What do flowers do? It's my mom and my dad. I'm going to tell a story about my mother's relationship with flowers. This is my mom on New Year's Eve, I think 1983. So the year would have been turning from 1982 to 1983, and I was 10 in 1982. My mother would have been in her first year of medical school at this time. My mother went back to medical school when I was 9, and she had 3 children. I was 9, my sister was 6, and my brother was 4 at the time. And my father, who was a lawyer, and was making decent money as a lawyer, you know, he had his own practice and stuff. My father, both my parents, by the way, are first generation college educated, poor Black people. My mother's from rural Mississippi, like a place that doesn't have a name, 50 miles north and east of Jackson, and my father is from the Richard Allen Projects in Philadelphia. They got married, and they had me at Wesleyan in 1972. Anyway, my mom, who loved flowers, was so freaked out when she was in medical school that the thing that she did to relax was to arrange flowers. My father, who was absolutely infuriated that my mother was in medical school and had left him alone with these 3 children to care for, not really alone, please, but you know, he thought he was alone with the 3 children, took his little money and made an account at this place called Robertson's Florists in Chestnut Hill, which is a very fancy flower shop in Philadelphia, Chestnut Hill being the whitest, most blue blood part of town. We lived a little bit further away in Mount Airy. And my mother had an account, this is in 1982, about $125 worth of flowers were delivered in a big box, unarranged, on our doorstep every Saturday morning. And my mother would spend an hour or 2 arranging flowers every morning on Saturdays. So there were flowers all over the house when I was a child. For me, the flowers, I don't know what to say. I wrote this down, though. They represent a kind of rage over my father's lack of control of my mother's life, an expression of penitence bound up in a sign of romance and courtly love that was profoundly out of place in my family. But the gesture's repetition and extravagance also indexed both my parents' labor and class ascent, thus completely transforming the function of the flowers, at least in my life. I don't have time now, but I'm going to point you to Jamaica Kincaid's garden book, especially a scene in that book where she describes a bout of excessive rose buying and concludes that abuse must be a part of growing roses. This is the originally proposed cover for Joni Mitchell's For the Roses. It's a drawing by Mitchell herself, and I don't know that you can see it clearly here, but basically it's a picture of a horse with a bouquet of roses coming out of its asshole. I think that there's a little music here. Do you recognize that? That's the other proposed cover of Joni Mitchell's For the Roses, which actually is now, the thing that we have now is Joni Mitchell's For the Roses is now the interior fold of that record. But this is Joni Mitchell's own butt, and this was the second proposal that she made to Asylum Records, and they said, no, you can't have this either, Joni. This other way of thinking about flowers, a way through Blackness and womanhood, is made more complex when I think about what Joni Mitchell sort of does in For the Roses, which is to launch a full-scale critique of the music industry, of fame, of her relationship to her heterosexual relationships, and the sort of convergence of all these things in the sort of prospect of a giant flowered fuck you. She, too, understood the flower as a sign of compromise with patriarchal power. She matters to me because of how her refusal of this compromise becomes a poetics that illuminates a complexly entangled interiority and reflects on isolation as one of the primary costs of understanding her actual lot. And I'm just going to close by playing you this last verse or so of For the Roses, that title song of this record.
Sure. Thank you. Let me really move in here. Oh yeah, can't see anyone. The elements to which I've chosen to respond to in the City of Ladies pertain to a deeply canonical and at the same time usually heavily sanitized first wave ancestor of contemporary feminist activism. 4 pieces chosen by Judy Chicago link directly to the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU. And I want to surface some of the less easily digestible features of this nowadays almost universally beloved historic war against the government for women suffrage. I hope in so doing to contribute to the discussion of women's disempowerment, power lust, and in many ways already long-standing power in the world. And looking at these items from the archive of the British suffragettes in the run-up to World War I, and bearing in mind what quite a few of these suffragettes got up to in its aftermath, I'm engaging the questions posed on the Dior banners hanging over the show. What if women ruled the world? Would there be violence, etc.? These leading questions are particularly arresting in a context where some feminists are celebrating all-female tank battalions and female majors in the Israeli Defense Forces participating in genocide. Even as a major Hollywood movie, Golda, harkens back nostalgically to the tenure 50 years ago of a certain female prime minister. Golda Meir, recall, famously declared, quote, "There is no such thing as Palestinians," unquote. Meanwhile, it goes without saying, other feminists continue to insist that settler colonial killing and displacement is a reproductive justice issue and a feminist issue. But I'm considering what one feminist from a different settler colony, namely Canada, did in 1914 as an extremely nationalist subject of Britain. I'm considering this particularly striking act of art vandalism at the National Gallery in London And contrary to what the Conservative Member of Parliament in Britain, Esther McVey, tweeted last November, this is not a, quote, painting depicting the suffragette movement, unquote, not least because it was completed in the 17th century. But there is a sense, perhaps, in which the object in front of us is what art critic Jerry Saltz referred to on his Instagram stories as a suffragette painting. And that's because on March 10th, 1914, Mary Richardson, an arsonist and hunger striker in Emmeline Pankhurst's guerrilla army of suffragettes, the WSPU, entered the museum and used a meat cleaver to destroy this painting, which she deemed pornographic, in a protest against Mrs. Pankhurst's imprisonment and as a cry of votes for women. Notwithstanding the repair and restoration of the original, Richardson's act undeniably remade the Toilet of Venus by Diego Velázquez in the image of a kind of insurrectionary feminism. I have tried to destroy the picture of the most beautiful woman in mythological history, Mary told the press after she was arrested, as a protest against the government for destroying Mrs. Pankhurst, who is the most beautiful character in modern history. Note that Venus is a woman while Pankhurst is degendered as a character. All 8 blows landed on the nude's back and buttocks. It helped, as Mary later reflected, that she, quote unquote, disliked the painting. Richardson had heard Emmeline speak in 1908 and fell in love on the spot. Lesbian obsession merged in her choice of target with somatophobic idealization, hatred of liberalism, and a certain kind of prurience bent on defending women's honor by eliminating obscene degeneracy. For 6 months, Mary served, this time in prison, for her queen. For 6 years, she had thrown herself into the WSPU membership's internal competition of self-sacrifice to earn the specially minted medals, honors, and favors that Mrs. P bestowed on her youthful knights. She was arrested and imprisoned 9 times and forcibly fed, according to one doctor, to the point of death before being released. In her leaflet, A Personal Experience of Torture, she writes that to remain passive under the immoral assault of forcible feeding would give one the feeling of sin, the sin of concurrence. Her suffragette name had been Polly Dick, but after her Venus stunt, it became Slasher. As it happens, just 2 months ago, a very different kind of feminism made use of the notoriety of the 1914 incident and the popularity of suffragettism more generally, hence the Tory MP's tweet, to draw attention to the climate crisis, using small hammers to damage the Venus's protective casing. Quote, "Women did not get the vote by voting," unquote, one of the activists said. It's true. Although actually the consensus view among historians is that property-owning English women received the vote shortly after the end of the war in 1918 as a kind of reward for their patriotic service to the imperialist crown. Millions of women performed wage labor for the first time within the war effort, notably in munitions factories. So the widely accepted idea is that upper middle class ladies earned their franchise, quote, not by throwing bombs, but by making them, not by raising children, but by sending them to die, unquote, to quote Nicoletta Gulace. Throwing bombs, what does she mean by that? Well, only some selective aspects of the violence of the suffragettes have been revived for fan consumption in recent years. For instance, their training in jiu-jitsu. Surprisingly few people know that between 1906 and early 1914, the suffragettes, so the WSPU as opposed to other suffragist groups, functioned as a paramilitary guerrilla force under the personality cult of a charismatic aristocrat. Operating in well-coordinated secrecy, the suffragettes carried out up to 20 incidents a month of property destruction between 1912 and 1914. That's sort of more than the IRA in their S-plan phase. They risked mass civilian injury by planting nitroglycerin bombs and potassium nitrate bombs in busy intersections, sporting grounds, cathedrals, pavilions, and politicians' houses full of sleeping servants. Maybe you did know that. Maybe not. What happens to any social movement when it relies too heavily on terrorism? What happens? I'd suggest the answer is it lurches inexorably to the right. This question, note, is distinct from the one I just mentioned of whether the suffragettes' heavy bombing campaign worked, right? Or whether it, on the contrary, delayed the passage of the parliamentary vote, enfranchising some women. What I'm pointing to is that ugly things happen in cults, and sometimes even uglier things happen when cults betray their followers. Imagine it, by the time The Slasher was released, the WSPU had been unceremoniously disbanded. Its magazine, The Suffragette, had been rebranded The Britannia. World War I had broken out, and instantly, Mary's beautiful commander had called off the March of the Women, breaking the Slasher's heart. Emmeline and her daughter Christabel promptly made friends with all the politicians they'd been bombing, and they disbanded their troops. Mary and many of her sisters felt sick. Eventually, some chose to follow those two patriotic Pankhursts into hypernationalism, xenophobia, eugenics, and strike breaking, and others veered left. A few turned to invent women's policing or set up voluntary vice squads and vigilante police patrols, and some, like Sylvia Pankhurst, became left communists, scolded by Lenin. Some founded jingoistic housewives clubs, like the Women's Guild of Empire. But Slasher Richardson and 7 other heavily decorated veteran suffragettes responded to the vacuum by transferring their allegiance to Sir Oswald Mosley. They joined the British Union of Fascists. It may surprise you to learn that several features in the Fascist Party magazine, Black Shirt, celebrated the ex-suffragette Black Shirt's personal histories as, quote, heroic agitators in a feminist revolution, unquote. You better believe it, fascism was making disgruntled suffrage veterans between the wars a serious offer. Fascisti in Italy were already talking about fascist feminism in 1921. Soon enough, Mussolini fan clubs all over Britain were recruiting alienated veterans of feminism, disillusioned with liberal democracy. British fascism was making them the promise that a totalitarian corporate state would give women greater privileges than they enjoyed under democracy. And it worked. The woman who slashed Venus for feminism told the magazine Fascist Week that she felt, quote, certain that woman will play a large part in establishing fascism in this country, unquote. And according to her comrade from the suffragette years, Nora Elam, who made this same conversion, quote, fascism alone will complete the work begun by the militant women from 1906 to 1914, so referring to the bombing campaign. Mosleyite propaganda was always quite strategic in presenting fascism to women as a system that would ensure equal pay for equal work, abolish restrictions on married women's employment, and prioritize material support to mothers and children. Black Shirts sold these policies implicitly or explicitly as superior to the fake feminism of anyone who still puts faith in the gerontocratic mainstream parties. Sound familiar? There's obviously much more to expound, but one question I'd like to surface, as I said, is this one. What can we learn from this switch that some suffragette heavyweights effected when they swore fealty first to a women's rights firebrand, then to a jackbooted blood and soil strongman? Because like it or not, some women, less than a century ago, saw no contradiction between the two, remaining in their minds not only feminists as they threw Sikh Isles, but even truer feminists than their erstwhile fellow WSPU hunger strikers. The practice of championing women was able to be a macho, hard-hearted sport, both in purple, white, and green, which is, the colors that you see all the gender-critical, trans-exclusionary radical feminists on Twitter using, repping the suffragettes, and in lightning bolt black. While the vital importance of feminism to anti-fascism is rather obvious, the role of feminism in fascism is a neglected counter-thesis, one that may help us better understand not only fascism in the present, but also ourselves, the inheritors of a liberal democratic feminist legacy that fascistic women also helped bequeath. In the context of an increasingly powerful cis-sexist and anti-trans feminism today, not to mention the aforementioned nationalist and colonial feminisms, the Zionist ones, as well as resurgent anti-sex worker varieties, I invite you, when you pass Slasher Richardson's anti-porn suffrage artwork in the City of Ladies, to think about the politics of passionate love for womanhood. Rather than celebrate all feminisms, we can better honor the history of feminist anti-fascism by attending to the non-synonymousness of feminism and anti-fascism. This, to me, seems like the best way to strengthen the arts by which we can turn feminism and anti-fascism into synonyms, contingently and in struggle. That's it. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. That was amazing. First, thank our Simone White, Sophie Lewis, and Kate Zambreno for being here. So I wanted to get started with the conversation. You also have time to ask each other questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So the first thing that I wanted to ask is that one of Judy's greatest contributions really has been her conception of both research and pedagogy, really as a social practice. You know, with her students at the feminist art program in the 70s, she assigned all women a syllabus of all women artists or writers, or she helped to create these early slide libraries, or libraries that now exist in many different archives, including at Harvard and at the University of New Mexico, near where she lives. But she also really saw research as a part of her artwork, really as an art method, which can be seen in the Dinner Party, the Birth Project, the Holocaust Project, you know, other projects that are in this exhibition. For her, these were all investigative enterprises, and they were very much motivated by this desire to learn and know more. And so first, just really broadly, I'm curious how these tenets of research figure into your work, because you do all seem to use it in very different and often very experimental ways. And so I can open that to any of you, or we can start with Kate, just in terms of your work with Heroines, which was this, you know, very experimental work in bringing together both, you know, art history and the history of writers, as well as memoir.
Thank you. And I do feel like I'm having, these were so amazing. It was so amazing to listen to both of you. Angle it. Okay, I'm angling it. Is that okay? Thank you, Sophie. See, we're helping each other. What I really thought about in your question of research when listening to Simone and Sophie's presentations is how research is like active, and it can be what Sarah Ahmed calls like the killjoy, right? There's an aspect of research that is digging into correcting blind spots, the carpet we walk on and exactly like the labor that went into it, or the multi-layered, dialectical, incredibly complex history of that painting called the suffragette painting. So I think hopefully it is within that spirit of Judy Chicago's research groups that we are playfully and openly antagonistic, right? And I think that is part of, at least I think, my feminisms, which is relational and hopefully ethical, that we are uncovering. Okay, so yeah, so what is said in a placard or said in a museum copy, and then what are these other narratives? What are these gaps? I think in Heroines, which I also wrote when I was teaching, there were lots of courses on feminist art where I began teaching, including at Columbia College, which was an art school, and Oakton Community College, where I taught a core class called Women and the Arts. It was a core class. But that is how a lot of that research came from Heroines. And I want to say that, yeah, I think research is like an active form of study, right? It's like this active thing. And the fact that we are in the spirit of and yet openly disagreeing, that is part of that research, right? To allow argument, I think.
Yeah, and quickly before Sophie and Simone can respond, something that I just thought of in relation to what you're saying is, well, of course, a wall text or any kind of didactic that you have in a museum, you can never say everything about somebody in 200 words. But when I've been giving a lot of tours of this exhibition, I always pause at the George O'Keeffe work, because that exact piece, which is called Black Iris, that's from the Met's collection, was one that Judy had wanted to reproduce in her autobiography, the first edition, which she published in the 1970s. So George O'Keeffe actually lived to be almost 100. So, she was out and about, still in the 70s when all these feminist artists were working. And Judy Chicago wrote to her and she said, "Can I use this image?" And George O'Keeffe said, "No, I'm not a woman artist." And it's very full circle that we have it back here, but I do think it's very important to think that all of these people are coming from very different perspectives, whether feminism, if it existed as an ism, was even part of their work, whether gender figured into their work. It is very subjective and very mutable, within this show.
I guess, the thing about poetry is that it doesn't really have an inherent relationship to academic forms of research, but poets before the late 20th century, when those of us who were professional poets really did need to have PhDs in order to work, it was always an art form that was was populated by people who are sort of excessively learned. And in a way, I think about people like Robert Duncan. I think about somebody like Nathaniel Mackey, who's kind of, an early precursor of the sort of poet with a PhD. And the reason isn't that, the reason is that poetry is also not didactic. It's actually not about the speaker. It really isn't. It is about a sort of foundational system of knowledge that allows you to make games. And if you don't have enough foundational material, your games are really boring. And so yeah, I think of more, not so much about research, which is in fact part of, the sort of common name for learning, but more about sort of attempting to become saturated with learning or something like that.
I mean, I think for you, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your use of citation, perhaps. Both at, you're an academic, and a poet, and just how that figures, into your work, even in your presentation here. You were bringing in stories relating to your personal life and to your family, but also talking, about pop culture and musicians, thinking about the work in the show. And so, these references are coming from so many different places.
Well, it's again, I wish I could see you all better. So again, the term citational, the idea of like a citational practice, for those of you, people call me an academic, and I'm like, what? I don't understand. But the idea of citation does belong to academic discourse. So, but when people talk about citational practices in writing, I think what they're actually asking us to think about or talk about are the actual other writers, artists, and folks that come up. And so the citational practice outside of academic research and academic writing is really about who else you're talking about and talking to. And it is true that I'm sort of searching at the moment for ways to kind of do a number of things at one time, and that which includes, anecdote, which includes, gossip and a certain amount of trash talking, but also, one of my primary reading practices is in fact critical theory. I read more criticism than I read novels. I read very few novels, actually. I don't read that much fiction, but I read a lot of poetry and I read a lot of critical theory. So how do you get those people in the same room? That's the question. And, my mother, who has an MD and is a psychiatrist, sometimes I talk to my mother and I forget she went to school. I'm like, Mom, that is not a grammatical sentence or whatever. But that's important to me. I talk to my mother every day, actually. And she's 75 now and she's retired, but she is a very, very important part of how I understand speech and how I understand beauty and how I understand, leisure and how I understand what it means to just kind of walk around in the world. And so it is important that she appear. And so, yes, if we can talk about that as a citational practice, but it's also more about a realistic presentation of what my total materials are.
So, in an effort to place Judy's work within this genealogy of feminist art making, in our City of Ladies presentation, we really hope to be celebrating sort of an idea of reciprocity that we're talking about an idea of networks instead of these singular heroic gestures. And I'm going to quote the curator Helen Molesworth, who's talked about this as a lateral approach, where she says that that this kind of work is in opposition to Oedipally infected narratives of influence in which sons either make an homage to their fathers, kill their fathers, or pointedly ignore their fathers. And so first I want to ask Sophie, because you have written very extensively about the idea of family and about the idea of kinship, how the idea of history figures into these definitions of group bonds. And you're obviously doing historical work right now, bringing in Mary Richardson. So I'm wondering how you think about that in relation to these genealogies.
I think there's potentially just as much of a tendency to want to kill our mothers in a genealogy of, feminist or just, non-male sort of artistic production. That's never that's real, and there's also a lot of other things that people find ways to do, perhaps laterally. My ideas have been full of that contradiction of being a writer who wants to have their name on the cover of a book, and the book is a commodity that says I said this, but the book itself, inside it says that authorship can only be co-authorship, and the contradictions of that are completely real. I mean, it's a banal point, but when you accept, as Kate talked about, I think very refreshingly, what it is to come and speak on a stage as part of a sort of City of Ladies exhibition. I have the same sort of thing going on in my talks sometimes, where I have the word unpaid next to my affiliation at University of Pennsylvania. It's very sort of strangely shocking, these sorts of how simple a gesture as making visible what the what the gig is can be quite disruptive. In terms of sort of the question of kinship, I mean, I could go on all night. I shouldn't. I just want to sort of point out that the family is internally a very violent space, and I mean, constitutively, materially, also psychically. And then when we use metaphors of kinship, to perhaps trying to put a queer gloss on them, rhizomatic, lateral, networked, I think we should still be conscious that there are other ways of naming ourselves as relations, to quote Tiffany Letabo King. And I also would probably urge some of the conversations about, matricide, which I completely agree, is a tendency that should be rejected in our scholarship, to still recognize that being a comrade transgenerationally, can be extremely litigious and belligerent. Respect is not the same as reverence. To respect someone from 1970, for me, like Shuli Firestone, it takes me a very long time to get to know someone archivally, and I really, I grieved my mother in 2019. She was really difficult and a bully, and perhaps so was Shuli Firestone, and so was Marilyn Monroe, and strangely these two figures became people that I just dwelt with in the archive and got to know and got to know and got to know better, and then felt like I would disagree with, but I love them at the end of the project. And I might even go so far as to say that there's a little bit of kind of claiming bad kin, as Alexis Shotwell puts it, claiming bad kin, even in a genealogy like Mary Richardson's. This is an enemy feminist, and yet, since I am a feminist in my bones, she's my kin, and I'm not afraid of fighting within womanhood. In fact, it's never not been that way. There's never not been fighting, sometimes sort of to the death, conceptually.
Am I doing it right? I think that is my major ideological issue with the framing of the City of Ladies show, because so much of feminism, I mean, the idea of like one woman, especially as the banner said, would there not be violence? What if women ruled the world? But I don't think it's recognizing that feminism is historical, but it's an active, living, multiple thing. There's not one feminism, and to say that there's one feminism is alighting race and class and gender and so much that's important. But feminism is so much about the history of people fighting with each other, arguing productively, being antagonists even to each other. But that's also like, thinking about matricide or killing the mother. I mean, there's so much. I mean, if we're thinking of Shulamith Firestone and that whole group of second wave feminists, how they isolated each other, how they completely alienated each other. And then they were isolated just in general, which is so much what happens in patriarchy, what happens under capitalism. So it's interesting to think that Judy Chicago knew Georgia O'Keeffe. Like, I love thinking that. I like that. And I like that there was prickliness there, that there was tension there. And for me, like, I can't consider the idea of a canon or an archive without considering the living, which to me is citational. It's the conversations with one's mother, but it's the conversations with one's friends or who one is reading, who one maybe also disagrees with. But there's something productive or reparative about that love or that interest. It's interesting. I thought that there was a decision not to include any artists of that time period. But yeah, Georgia O'Keeffe is in the show, was a major artist in the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, the intention or the thinking behind...
Not alive. I mean, I know she's not alive. I mean, she was like alive during Judy Chicago's time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The thinking behind we really wanted to have artists who were specifically working before Judy was working in earnest. I mean, there are a couple pieces that are from the early 60s, but the idea was really to link back to her practice both as a educator and a researcher on women's history, and to also really rethink what this exhibition is if the dinner party wasn't going to be in it, because it's permanently installed at the Brooklyn Museum and it never was any intention that it would be here. But that is to say, many of the artists that are featured on that floor were still working when Judy was working, although many of the works that are there were done before. But, Anna Eastman is in there, who was her mentor. And so, artists really changed throughout their entire career, obviously. But yeah, Georgia O'Keeffe, that painting is from, it's a very early painting, but because she lived to be almost 100, she saw so many different periods in art production that is, pretty astounding. She died in the 80s. Yeah. I wonder, do you have any questions for each other about this?
I would, if there are questions from outside, I'd be...
Oh, are we? I mean, there are a few more things that are prepared, but we're also running short on time. So we can open it up to the audience now if we want. And thank you so much again to everybody who's here. Okay, do we have anybody?
None? This is always an awkward transition.
Yeah,
but,
it is.
But just to say, this is an open conversation, not like a test. Yeah. Just I have a mic.
It isn't fully formed, but because no one else is for it, I'll try. I thought that was all wonderful. Thank you so much. I think my question is mostly for Sophie. Kind of out of interest of another conversation I had earlier today with someone about, I guess, international / non-American focus on women's movements and feminist art. And whether you think, because obviously you talked about the sort of hidden histories that are in that painting, and if there are a certain sort of like flattening, or fetishizing is kind of the wrong word, but like a narrowness when looking at art from non-American artists and not seeing like the complexity that's going on there. Do you understand the question that I mean? Essentially, I was talking to someone earlier today and they were talking about how shocked they were about the transphobia in the UK. As you can hear, I'm English, compared. And they were kind of shocked that outside of America, places can be so awful as well, because there are so many issues here. And yeah, if you could, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that not really a question? Sorry.
I think it's an important comment. Yeah. What can I say that's actually generative and worth people's while? Yeah, I mean, I agree. Yeah. I was, I looked at the catalogue and not being someone who really writes much on visual art or thinks much on visual art, I was pretty much just sort of going, oh, I've just researched this person for ages for my book on enemy feminisms, sort of 200 years of it. And I think, yeah, just I sort of genuinely did want to know whether people were aware of the amount of bombing in the Votes for Women campaign, because anecdotally in my life, it's not known. I'm not an uncomplicated sort of non-violence person myself, but I find it very interesting, the flattening, to use the word you just brought in, that goes on. Of course, American suffragists were actually appalled by what the British suffragettes were doing for that reason. But the historiography has been very, very sanitizing, and the sort of 100-year anniversary a few years ago of the British sort of vote for 30-year-old plus property owning ladies was, a big exercise in femo-nationalism and self-congratulation. Everybody always loved those valiant women, didn't they? Always, of course. I mean, by the way, I'm speaking extremely self-critically. I mean, I literally know that song from Mary Poppins,
Oh, she just died.
Oh, what?
Yeah, she just died.
That's right. Sister suffragette, yeah.
That person.
Yeah.
Yeah, she
Did
just died
she?
like last week.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the New York
Our
Times.
daughters will adore us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a 7-year-old. We're not going to start singing. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Vivian Elliott, who I write about in Heroines, was in the British Union and fascists.
Really?
Yeah, she was. She was a British fascist. She felt completely isolated, felt completely, it was like you called it a cult. I mean, of course it's a cult, right? She was seduced by the costumes, which was a huge way that women were recruited to the British fascists. It was like what is it, like the red lapel, and what else was the costume?
In the BUF?
Yeah.
It was actually quite plain, right? Navy mainly, I think, just not.
But there was like a little red lapel.
Yeah, the pin,
there was something
because they had a
chic
lightning
about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very, very fashion. But yeah, and she joined it. It's interesting when we try to resurrect the lives of, let's say, women within feminism, it can often feel sanitized. We're not supposed to look at all the other like facets of someone's life, like their politics. Yeah, which is so important. You can appreciate the history while also considering the, what is it, like the ghosts, it's the history of the world, right? So it's got colonialism, violence, racism, transphobia in it.
I mean, the other thing about this particular sort of configuration, like the City of Ladies configuration, is that there was almost no way that it wouldn't be explosive if you put, do you know what I mean? There's so much in there that the expectation that there would not be conflict either with or from, the viewer or among the sort of like figures who are presented as a sort of coherent whole, that is impossible. And in a way, the only surprise is that there isn't more like active friction, right, being expressed in the show and sort of like in talking about the show. I mean, and the fact that I walked in and was like, what's on the ground? Like that it's just a typical gesture for me in some ways, but it's also, it's also an indication of this kind of like, you put different elements in the room and they're going to interact. And, they're going to interact globally, they're going to interact, on a cellular level. And so I don't know that there's any,
Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
Hi, Tess.
I wonder if there's an expectation that women, girls, are supposed to get along together or else hate each other in a way that men they hate each other, but they get along together. They play golf. There's something imposed on our way of relating. And I go to, I'm not a public intellectual, so excuse me, but I was at a talk on Ms. Magazine, and Abigail Disney, who's a filmmaker and she gives a lot of money to things, she's wonderful. She was talking about Ms. Magazine, feminism, and then someone got up and asked her why she hadn't made a statement about the women who were raped in Israel. And she apparently, and I didn't know any of this before, had taken a similar, not saying anything the way the UN had about women in Israel. And she didn't really have anything planned and suddenly all these other women were getting up. Now it was at a synagogue, so those were who the women were. But why, it was so shocking to me, and why should it be that women should all agree about everything or at the same time be mean girls? When can we get over that? And whatever.
I actually really like your way of asking this question. I mean, I think that's what we're all sort of suggesting, that there isn't, that is not our only choice. And also that, I mean, maybe for myself, I can only speak for myself, I guess, I think that the primary problem is not getting along with other women. The problem is that once you begin to sort of form a feminist consciousness, you are going to be punished, like immediately. And the only real question is, how bad is the punishment going to be? And so that's, for me, the question that comes out of your question. The question is how to form alliances that are not simply mirroring patriarchal forms of relation that really are quite punishing for femme people. And, that's what we're trying to get at, I think, all of us.
I want Sophie to go.
I mean,
I have something to say, but I want to know what you have to say.
Well, it's not the city of feminists, is it?
Oh, yeah. And since Christine de Paysan was protesting there were so many medieval texts viewing women as wicked, like the Jezebel stereotype. So the City of the Ladies is actually, I mean, it's autobiographical. It's one of the first-person texts. She puts herself in it as a persona, but it's like all women are virtuous. They're ladies. It's which is why I was kind of wondering about the tonality of the title. But
And just by the way, the medieval text for me, like I've just been reading all this stuff about like Black feminism and love, and I'm like, oh God, let's never say love again, right? Like so, so, that's not even a given here.
No, love is a great way to decrease wages, isn't it?
Yes.
I think, which is what, no, I mean, I think, so just to sort of spell out, I think many projects have been really, really for real feminism and also fascism. which it might seem like a sort of small intervention, but I think it's quite different from many of the things that I appreciate that have been said. In 2018, there were lots of books about white feminism, right? And people have been saying different things and historicizing differently. But so many books in 2018 have been about, this impasse that people feel feminism is at right now. But usually the account is that we could look back at the 200-year history and see what got left out. And then we could sort of keep the good. And I just don't think that's the right story at all, right? And I mean, Emma Heaney, plenty of other people have told many different stories, usually in academia. Emma Heaney, my favorite, talks about cisness as feminism's counter-revolution, and talks about the emergence of cisness within feminism as a kind of, anti-feminist feminism, historically emerging with sort of the response to sexology within modernism and so on. But I think we need to sort of think about how, someone like Hugh Lemmy, who's a gay man living in Barcelona, who's Irish, who's written about Hildegard von Bingen. In fact, he's not written about her, he's written with her. There's a book called Lingua Ignota, Unknown Language. Actually, it's from Ignota Press.
And Banu Kapil wrote the foreword to it and was in kind of collaboration. It was like a seance.
And this is, this in terms of feminist practice, this is, he's writing, Hildegard von Bingen is a co-author listed because of Hugh's practice of sort of transgenerational spiriting and creating, which reminds me a lot of like Diane di Prima and how she felt she was a buddy of Paracelsus's, and this kind of way of time traveling with different alchemical artists and writers and thinkers, which I envy a lot, and which makes me really want to kind of break down the walls of this city of ladies and and let the fight happen. let the barricades be built.
Well, with that, we have to end soon. But if you have any final thoughts, Kate or Simone, I welcome it. Or okay, well, thank you so much. Appreciate you being here.